You are listening to Frog Talk, presented by Black Ribbon.
Welcome to another episode of Frog Talk. You know what it is. We're diving deep into the power of organizational culture and how it's redefining leadership in the workplace. We'll explore how culture has become a foundational competitive advantage for companies looking to lead the business landscape. I have the great pleasure of speaking with Ben Ortlip, author of Culture is the New Leadership and creator of the Culture MRI. Ben's journey is awesome. In 1990, he walked away from a prestigious position at a respected ad agency and started a 30-year mission to understand what really makes people happy and productive at work. His research and insights have shaped the cultures of top organizations, including UPS, Delta, Salesforce, and Chick-fil-A. Ben, man, it's so great to have you here, and welcome.
Nadir, I'm so excited to be here. You and I have known forever that we align.
Yeah.
And so just to talk about the changing world, I hope we're coming to you today in stereo because our minds are so linked intrinsically to each other that it's like both barrels blasting today. But anyway, I'm so excited to sit down and formally tee up some of the things that I know your listeners deal with every day. I think they're going to relate and maybe get some clarity out of some of what the language that we've been able to bring together to some of this. So anyway.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm excited. There's a whole episode right there.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually feel like, I wish that everyone was telepathic so we could just sit here.
Yeah.
But just to give some context, tell me about, so I've never heard the story from you. I started reading your book. I finally got it the other day. But I just really want to hear the story behind that pivot. How can a job so good be this bad?
Yeah, man. So telling. I'll tell you the story. So I was in advertising, and as I tell you the story, think about this. This is like replaying, I don't know, a train wreck, but in slow motion, a 30-year train wreck. But so my first career, like anybody, I came out of college, did a little bit of grad school, and, had a great profession. In my case, I was in advertising, and I was a creative person on the agency side, writing, commercials and doing ad campaigns for different companies, and just, great stuff. Enjoy it. That's what I went to school for. And so if it hadn't been for the culture of the places where I worked, it would have been great. And of course, I didn't know that at the time. All I knew was that, okay, I'm really excited about what I do. I feel like I was created to do this. So I started working. My first job, it was phenomenal. I mean, if I had to pick one agency where I'd hoped to get a job, it would have been this one. And sure enough, they even recruited me. So it was great. And I worked there for a while. I didn't get paid much money, but I didn't care, which was kind of interesting. Eventually that became, an area that I wanted to improve. So, like a lot of people in the advertising world, I moved around agency to agency. And as I did, I ended up in different places and, again, unable to put my finger on it. But one day, I kind of woke up in one of the agencies and it's just kind of a dud, really. I was still working on pretty neat projects, but it was the people I was around and I wasn't able to put my finger on it. Things that much later on, I would understand, in terms of the psychometrics of what I was experiencing, things like the way respect is communicated from one person to another, or the sense of opportunities for advancement. All those subtle little psychometrics that determine whether or not, we're alive and engaged. So yeah, I woke up one day, in this job, and I just said, "Wow, this is a great career, and technically on paper, this is a fantastic job." The pay went way up, but I was just like, "I'm so done with this." Most people, would experience something like that and not really know exactly why. We'll pick something and blame it on that, but the reality was, I didn't know. All I knew was I can't do this. It wasn't like I was just emotionally worn out and fatigued. It was just like, I don't want to spend, a year of my life trying to figure this out or anything else. So I just left.
Was it just like an inherent, like an absolute truth? You were like, I can't be here. Like your entire body and being was like,
I think I'm a little over analytical, and so and not overly sensitive. I was just philosophical. I was like, I've always been taught to believe that, life and work have a relationship, but one doesn't, drive the other. And so I was just, kind of open minded about it. I was like, well, this sucks. So I should probably change it. And I don't have to figure out why, but I was just like, and I'm a spiritual person, so I've always believed that, where God closes a door, he opens a window. That's, I'm pretty sure, not in the Bible, uh, but something like that is. Anyway, so yeah, it wasn't like hit me like a ton of bricks kind of thing, but I was like, all right, when things are less than, you know good, then it's time to, take a leap and look for something else. It was early enough in my career. I wasn't married yet. There were still 2 or 3 months until I was to get married. So,
so
um,
you still had a chance. There wasn't
yeah,
too much dependency yet.
yeah, she was already on the hook. Um, the invitations had gone out. Um, but yeah, so I just sort of, I don't know, followed my heart and just
Yeah.
was like, I don't feel like going in. So I'm going to go tell them I don't feel like coming in. And, you know, we'll
Yeah, you
just see
said
how
you
that
like
plays
just
out.
stopped going. Like, was that in your book, you're like, I just stopped going to work.
Well, it was a little bit gradual. I mean,
Okay.
honestly, I talk about it in the book how I was really not a great employee at all. It started out with me coming in a little bit late and taking long lunches and leaving a little bit early, and that bothered me because I knew I was stealing from the company, um, and I didn't want that to be the long term solution. But I also had to be honest with where I was, because I could have honored the clock, and just kind of run the four corners offense and run out the, technically I was there from 9 to 5, and all that, but my heart wasn't in it, and that's not why they hired me. They wanted somebody who was excited about the project, and honestly, there were other people working there who were doing great. Um, and they were excited and they were getting opportunities, and it just didn't work out for me at that point. And later on, I would understand exactly what it was. Everybody's different. So I just kind of quit coming in for a few days, and finally they were like, "Hey, let's check on Ben, um, see if we need to file a missing persons report." And I think at that point I was still trying to figure out, what do I want to do. Um, and so, I came right in, had a convo with the boss, and we both just sort of were looking at each other going, okay, you're done here, right? And it was like, are you going to fire me, or do I need to quit? Whatever needs to happen. So again, it was a horrible experience. I'm not here to talk about, this is what you need to do if you don't like your job, because it was awkward. It was, um, it's not the greatest display of integrity on my part by any means. But here's the key, Nadir. It was me being introduced to the fact that there can be subtle, almost undetectable things about work that change the way that someone brings effort to a job. And more interestingly, I didn't realize it at the time, but this is what was happening, beginning to happen to the entire workforce. And so I ended up, writing was a sort of a passport, if you will, into all kinds of other opportunities. And so I kept writing and kept, freelancing, and some of it was advertising and marketing. But eventually I started writing long form content for people who speak on leadership and management, who run organizations and things like that, and teach about what it is like to motivate a workforce. So by pure coincidence, it sounds like something that I set out to do. Is like, okay, well, now I'm interested in this, but it was a pure coincidence. And I ended up getting an education on what had happened to me as the guinea pig, and so that's how I began to understand it, and eventually, sort of saw this sort of 30-year story unwinding all around us. And that's what I wrote a book about. So, and that was a gradual process. I've been doing this probably 15, 20 years now. So,
did the term culture even sort of cross your mind when this was all happening?
not at all. I didn't hear the word culture. So get this, I came out of advertising, and, I did a lot of corporate, marketing, industrials, things like that, writing content, same big companies, everywhere, but a lot of internal stuff. So it had a lot to do with the operations and the way communication flows inside an organization. And then eventually I started ghostwriting content for, like I worked for the Drucker. I did projects for the Drucker Institute. Peter Drucker is the father of modern management. So all of a sudden I was studying management, because I had to learn his stuff in order to contribute to the project. So, so I came out of there with, I can't imagine an MBA from any school is any more intensive than what I did, in terms of I came away really understanding what management is. And I had minored in business in college, and this was just way deeper. But and then I ghost wrote for some of the thought leaders who go around and talk about leadership and write books on leadership. These are people you've heard of, but as a ghostwriter, you're sort of in the background, but you're an understudy when you're a ghostwriter, and you have to really understand everything that they're and be able to, generate content that represents what they're saying in the world about these different things. So again, I had to learn about management. I had to learn about leadership. And it wasn't until, I don't know, around 2010 that I was handed projects that had the word culture featured on them, the culture edition, things like that, because there was some magazine content too. And I remember thinking to myself, oh, that's interesting. It felt like just kind of a hip way to say the vibe of our organization.
Yeah.
And then one day, so I just sort of went with it, and I was like, well, culture is kind of the byproduct of management and leadership. So yeah, that makes sense, but they're just coming up with a cool way to say it.
Yeah.
Well, a few maybe months or years went by, and I got asked to ghostwrite a book about culture with one of those, well-known authors.
Right.
And I was so excited. I was like, okay, I'm finally going to learn what culture is. They taught me what management is. They taught me what leadership is. And I get a front row seat, with one of these gurus. But after about a year working on this book, the author and I kind of both looked at each other and was like, this is just, leadership and management. And you're not ready to write a book about culture. Like, I don't understand how distinctively different this is. And that's, again, a testament to just how things were changing in the workplace itself. And what I came to realize later was that, as I looked through history, recent history, it was almost like the way computers had developed. There was a time when sort of the operating system of business or organizations was management. And, the way companies approached it was, hey, I'm going to manage these people. And, it was a little more authoritarian in nature. But that's how it was. And then there was, I don't know where the demarcation point is, but there was a time when it sort of shifted and suddenly it was something different. And it was maybe less authority, but more almost like influence. And instead of using the word management, we were using the word leadership to describe what was important to the organization. And I played that out and realized that, even if you look at the bookstores, there were books on management for a while, and then now you can't find one, and it's all books on leadership. But I noticed that both of those disciplines, management and leadership, seemed to be suddenly inadequate to accomplish these objectives. And a lot of organizations were really frustrated. And I thought that culture probably had something to do, almost like the third operating system that I was aware of. But nobody had really codified it yet and said, here's what it is. Here's how you can learn how to do it. Instead, it was just, kind of random ideas like, help everybody have more fun. I remember job rotation was one of the first attempts at what they called culture. It was like, so they won't get bored. Let's have them switch jobs all the time.
Yeah.
I mean, that was a real thing back in the maybe 80s and 90s. Anyway, so people are trying to figure this out. And I remembered something that Peter Drucker wrote early in his career. And I wouldn't have known this if I hadn't, been in the bowels of the organization working for it. But he talked about when he first started working on management, he was explaining, how did you get into this? And he basically said, I was just trying to help companies. And there was very little about how to do this, because, he was coming off the heels of an agrarian civilization. And the Industrial Revolution happened, and then all these people walked out of the fields and into the factories. And they're like, how do you do organization? There's never been these things before, assembly lines and all that. And he was coming in to help and to say, you need to manage people's time. You need to manage their expectations. You need to teach them. You need to train them. You need to select them well, and he said this telltale phrase in something he wrote. He said he remembered doing all this, and he was keenly, because there was nothing written, he just had to figure it out. And he said I was keenly aware that I was laying the foundations of a new discipline. And I was like, oh, so that's how this happens.
Yeah.
There's people that just kind of get in there and figure it out. And when I studied leadership, I realized that the same thing was true. It was like people, and I could tell you their names, Warren Bennis and, everybody under Stephen Covey, right? But there were people that had to just kind of jump in with executives, roll up their sleeves and figure out what are the problems, what are the principles that govern these problems, and what are the protocols that we should prescribe in order for people to navigate these well. And so I looked at it as, okay, somebody's got to do this with culture too.
Right.
And, we have a new operating system. Now we just need to figure out what it is and how to use it.
It's a design problem, right? It's if you're coming in and you're essentially observing what's happening. And if you have, in school, in my master's program, we learned that we're taught that humans by definition are designers. Humans are all designers. We're problem solvers. And design is the process of problem solving. But then just like in culture, you have trained designers and then you just have other people. And so when you have sort of the mindset to be able to pick up on observations and you have an astute sort of ability to see the things that other people don't see, or broken links or something that could be better. There's a concept in design thinking where you think about what could be and then work backwards, right? And I call it the "wouldn't it be cool if" statement, because we think about, like, imagine this ideal situation because you're seeing something that doesn't quite work, or it could be better, or there's all this contention somewhere. And then you go, wouldn't it be cool if, like, like everyone just got along? Or wouldn't it be cool if, we didn't have to work 10 hours a day or whatever? And so that's really interesting. And the culture is the same way. Like culture exists inherently. It's a consequence of interactions, of language, of values, of behavior, of whatever. It's a consequence of reactions to certain kinds of a stimulus and otherwise. Or, so you have the inherent culture, and then to your point, you have the designed culture, something that's curated, that's intentional, that's purposeful, because you're trying to achieve something in particular.
Yeah. And isn't it interesting that you and I both seem, intuitively to believe that this should work?
Yeah.
we both kind of have this radar for this is supposed to work, so let's redesign it until it does. Or let's walk away and leave if we're not going to be able to play a role in designing it. I mean, I think that's the fundamental starting point, is the belief that it's not just random chaos, that there's actually a way for thousands of people to walk into a building every day and to function.
Yeah.
And to not be dysfunctional. And so if that's your mindset, then it's only a matter of time until you can do the causality work to figure out, okay, what does it take for that, situation to work? How do we make it function? And so, I know enough about you to know that we both are intuitively trying on different solutions until we start to understand. And then there's pattern recognition. And eventually we come away with, a set of core principles. And that's kind of how any discipline is understood and then reapplied with consistency. So the same thing happened, and it's been happening in culture. But if I had to pick a demarcation point, it was sometime in the late 80s and early 90s. In fact, one of the stories I tell, I love the history of the workplace. And it really just tells such a revealing story about the psychology of work. And I'll just simplify it to say that, there was a time 100 years ago when people were really thinking a lot about, hey, where am I going to get my next meal? And I'm willing to take my family and get on a ship and change continents if it means that there's a better chance that I can feed my family. And then now, fast forward to today, and you've got kids who are, just they can't get them out of their parents' basement.
Yeah.
Because the food sits in cans or bags waiting for them to eat or Uber order or whatever. But and all they do is game all day. So the psychology of work and ambition and motivation and everything, I mean, that's a huge shift, but it happened gradually.
That's right.
And so, I think the real turning point, I was actually, there's a story I tell in the book about accidentally being at Woodstock in the 60s. And we were literally, my little family was driving across the state that same weekend, and we took shortcuts and ended up, my parents are classical musicians. They didn't know anything about rock and roll. So they were completely clueless that there was this big festival going on. But that generation, the hippie generation and the rebellion of the 60s and 70s was really a response to, hey, I know all that 50s and post-World War II stuff and, all the structure and, go to college, get a degree, enter the workforce, work for the man 40 years and retire and Social Security and all that. That was basically the first inklings of a generation that was saying, "Nuh-uh, that's not what I'm up here for," and their motto was tune in, turn on, and drop out. I mean, it doesn't get any more explicit than that. And even though the hippies were sort of a fringe segment of society at that point, I think it was indicative of a trend in the way people thought about embracing, the mores that were being handed down to them. And so by 1990, apparently, and what happened after that was, there was a lot of hostile takeovers and corporatization and capitation and healthcare and all these, sort of corporate, movements, I guess. A lot of people got laid off, lost their pensions and everything. So it jaded that population even more. And so by 1990, there were people so disengaged that Gallup launched their famous, Q12 engagement study. Now, the reason they did that is because, people were starting to say, hey, what's wrong? They're showing up sort of, but they're not really giving it their all the way they used to.
It became so common. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I don't know where you find your demarcation points in there. I've always thought that the late 60s and the hippie movement was one. The 90s, when engagement surveys began, was obviously another. But then, of course, you look at COVID and the big quit and everything else, and we got another big demarcation point happening now. But it's all the same thing. It's the psychology of the workforce is evolving and changing, and our operating systems for running companies has to evolve and change with it, just like it always has. It went from management to leadership. And so my thesis would be that nowadays we need to be switching to an operating system that might be called culture.
Yeah. And sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say the clarifier for me was just looking at Maslow's hierarchy.
Yeah.
And watching how the workforce had been slowly progressing up this sort of hierarchy of needs, survival level stuff like, as long as you give me food, shelter, and clothing, you can scream at me and traumatize me, but I'll still show up eager to earn a living. And then there was sort of this period, maybe in the 1900s, when it was a little more than that. It was like, okay, we're going to be nice to you and give you promotions and make you the leader someday, or at least some of you. And now we have this workforce that's more about, some people called it the gig economy, where everybody wants to do their own thing. They want to have their own company. They want autonomy. Even if they work for another company, they still want it to be their
grooming
their
leaders. Everyone's going to be a leader one day.
Yeah. And so, so when you think about Maslow's hierarchy, it's like we had survival. Then we had an era where success was what motivated. And now it's like, this self-actualization concept, this sort of, I need my work to be my identity and my expression of self to the world. And the way I say it is this: for the first time, and I looked at, the Roman Empire, what was their world like, the Egyptians, the Assyrians, I've never found a workforce that has had to deal with this issue. So technically, for the first time in the history of mankind, the workforce has reached what Abraham Maslow would call self-actualization. And so, so psychologically, how do I lead a company who really just wants work to be an expression of their identity and their sense of belonging and community and things like that. So we got to figure this out.
I've been thinking a lot about this over the last week, and since you and I met, and since we've been talking about this conversation, and I landed on something that might be a little controversial, but because I was thinking about how and reading your book and thinking about how work has become synonymous with purpose, and the idea that, my own vision is to eliminate the phrase work to live and live to work.
Yeah.
Because to harmonize the two, because of how life has evolved and how humans have sort of gained this, like you're saying, this desire for a higher purpose. And it's interesting. Start with why. And it's interesting because in the West, especially in this country, you're talking about kids sitting in their parents' basement and so on. Yeah. Social media is essentially showing you how bored society has become, because there's no challenge, there's nothing to do, everything is simple, everything is easy. And you can talk about the complications and challenges all day long, but at the same time, just no matter how you slice it, your life is perfect. Like, there's not enough problems actually. And if you think real hard, I have like a buddy in Nigeria who's Nigerian, and he's 22 years old. He's a design prodigy. And he's like, I don't have time to be depressed. It's just these kinds of reality shifts and nuances are really interesting. And so I started thinking about, how we're trying to create people first organizations and human centered organizations that put people's needs and values and desires essentially above all else to impact their quality of life, and how that impacts communities and the people around it and in it and so on. And I started thinking about, okay, well, there is a space that sort of is on two sides of the fence, where the phrase "what's your malfunction, soldier" comes from. And it's the military space, and the military is famous, if not infamous, depending on who you're talking to, for its culture, its inherent culture. And then I started going down this path of this thought process, because soldiers are trained like machines to be like a machine, and even language reinforces that. But at the same time, the military is chock full of camaraderie, of purpose, of identity, of brotherhood and sisterhood and so on, that exists outside of outside of war, and in military communities and so on, families and all this. And then and I landed on, what if the military, because historically we're talking about the last 100 years or even the last 40 years, where the idea that you're describing about Maslow's hierarchy of needs and self-actualization becoming more graspable in the workplace and being more visible and so on. And the military has been around since the dawn of civilization. And could it be the original culture brand, a system that creates unshakable loyalty, shared language, personal identity through a collective mission?
Yeah, it's one of the first sort of institutions. Absolutely, the political and civic boundaries, those boundaries of people groups. The word tribe is something that has been used to describe what goes on in workplaces, and not by accident. The thing that makes the military work, if you think about this, survival is such an important part whenever authority is the key to the operating system. The reason the military works is because of authority. And so the reason that authority works is because you have people who are desperate for survival, not because of the war, but the people who fill the ranks of the military are people who are there because they need a paycheck, or they're there because they were conscripted into the army through a draft or something like that. And so there's this system, this authority-based structure where they're forced to exist. And so the military can, be ruthless with its training requirements and ruthless with its executional requirements and things like that. But it's the operating system of authority that determines whether it works or not. And then the problem in the free market is that there are people who, if they're given the opportunity to pursue some of their psychosocial needs beyond just survival, right? Once they've achieved survival, they've pursuing success, either climbing the ranks in status, maybe establishing a home and a community and raising a family, the things that freedom brings beyond survival. It's a different operating system. That's where authority yields to something called influence, where there's a little more of a give and take between the employer and the employee.
So that's where it gets interesting, because at the same time, especially in more recent times, people who join the military aren't necessarily doing it out of necessity or because they need a paycheck or something. They might be coming from a military family. They might have a true passion for what it stands for and so on. And outside of the war, outside of casualty and so on. But what I also realized is that, I mean, some former military will even admit that space is the only place they've really truly felt purposeful, bonded, a sense of pride or otherwise, right? And like even struggle to sort of replicate that in so-called civilian life. And so the thing that where it gets interesting in what you're describing is that modern workplaces want to sort of replicate that side of it without dehumanizing the people that are involved in it, so that there is this people focused give and take like you're describing. And I find that fascinating.
Well, let me comment on what's interesting is the role that purpose plays. So there are three sort of core drivers that show up regardless of where you are in Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And when you reach the top, like we are with today's workforce, they become the pure motivational forces. The three things I'm talking about are called craft, cause, and community. Those are essentially the three expressions of self-actualization. So there's almost like love languages. You have three different people that are all self-actualizing, and one of them may be all about, we call it being good at something, at mastering a craft. There's a sense of identity and purpose, if you will, around the craftsmanship that you express yourself through. And so you can think about artists or entertainers or, even someone, who performs a master skill, whether it's a surgeon or a woodworker. But that's one of the core drivers, and it's biological because that's associated with dopamine. The second one, craft, cause, and community. The second one is just pure purpose, that this matters in the world. So there are people who join the Peace Corps. There are people that work for NGOs, or they go into ministry because their primary driver is to do work, to be involved with things that just matter. And so this is associated, again, biologically with serotonin in the brain. And then the third one is community. So craft, cause, and community, and this is the desire to, have a sense of belonging. That there are people who are self-actualizing, and what they really want is to be where everybody knows their name, to feel like an intrinsic, irreplaceable part of a tribe. And again, the biological, uh, tie there is oxytocin. So if you think about it, those are all, you can find those lower in Maslow's hierarchy. People who are seeking survival. The purpose or the cause is we have to survive. And so that's their motivation. And then they achieve success. The purpose is to be successful. And then as they reach the top where all those other things have been accomplished, they start looking outside themselves and how can I be part of, in the universe, something that matters. So craft, cause, and community are sort of the fundamental elements of workplace motivation. And when you play those across Maslow's hierarchy and how the workplace has evolved, it starts to make a lot of sense. And especially when you look at millennial workers today and you say, well, what do they want? If I can't entice them out of the basement with $20 an hour, what are they looking for? And they're looking for an opportunity to be good at something.
Are you talking about Gen Z or millennials?
Either one.
I'm a millennial.
Well,
I'm an old millennial.
It started with, the conversation started with millennials,
I know.
And it's gotten worse. But there are three things that everybody wants now if you're self-actualizing. I want to be good at something. I want to believe in something.
Yeah.
Or I want to belong to something. Yeah. And most of us have a mixture of all three of those. But it's often that somebody will be just sold out strong on just one of them.
Yeah.
And so if you come at that person start with why, let's say you're a craft person. I had a bunch of software engineers once, and they were all craft people. And they didn't care, about world events or anything.
Yeah.
They just weren't, they didn't have a why, they had a what. And so if you came at them with, hey, what's your why? They're like, what are you talking about? I just want to do fun stuff and write fun code. And there's another group of people who, I don't have a why. I just want to hang out with my peers and my people. I found my people. And, so you we have to go beyond our just, purpose statement and really unpack it a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. It's critical that you emphasize that, because we even, like right now, for example, I'm working with a client as we speak, and they have employees across the board. There are laborers and who work, in the warehouse and so on, who basically move pallets from one side of the warehouse to the other side of the warehouse and things like this. And some of them are even illiterate. And, they're just happy to have a job, and they're happy to, in a place where they can go buy something and feel respected and so on. And these are all real consequences of having a job. And they don't care. They couldn't give a shit about, why this place exists or what the purpose of this company is, or even if they did, might not even really understand it, but then, you have like the more leader, the managers and the middle managers and people like running people and so on. And they have more, not only understanding, but desire to understand what the vision is, and like to rally behind something and so on, to have a sort of greater purpose, as it were. And my response to that always, to anyone who objects about, what's so important about the purpose, I always say it doesn't necessarily have to resonate with everybody, but it doesn't mean that everyone cannot have a better experience. Emotionally, you'll feel something if there is clarity and if there is direction. Because I believe this culture has to be influenced from the top. It's a top-down approach. Leadership, management, the top layer still has to embody it and to manifest it throughout the company for it to actually take place and for it to have any sort of real resonance. And if when that happens, then the staff that doesn't really care about or doesn't really understand the whys and the purpose and the vision and all this, all the branding language, as it were, will still have a better experience, and they'll go home feeling better, and they'll wake up feeling better, and they'll still go, I don't really know what's going on, but it's better than it was yesterday, and it's better than it was a year ago. My wife is somehow happier. My husband is somehow happier. My kids are happier. I'm less pissed off. I'm not waking up with weird dreams. These kinds of things are all real and real consequences.
As humans, we're notoriously unskilled at understanding our own needs. We really are. I can't put my finger on it. I'm not sure what it is. And even when you explain it to me, think about sitting in front of a psychologist getting psychoanalyzed, and you're like, really? That's my problem? And then, you sit with that for a year and a half before the light bulb goes on, and you go, yep, that's, I now see it. That was my problem. So picture the guy who's just trying to, move along through the career. We're inept at being able to understand what we need in order to thrive. And so I was looking to make sense of all this because it's different for everybody. There's all these different places where people are, like you said, there's the frontline workers who are moving pallets throughout the factory. And then there's people who are, sitting in, marble adorned offices, philosophizing about, something. And we're all different. We all need different things. And I sort of ended up creating what I called a framework or an index, the motivational response index, to map out and try to make sense of all of those different needs. And it's essentially 15 sort of needs that cover basically everything, including craft, cause, and community. Those are the top 3. But sometimes it's super practical stuff. Like I have a need to work in a non-chaotic workplace. I have a need for a paycheck. I have a need for stress to be a managed factor and not a out of control, unmanaged one. I have a need to understand the vision of where this company is. Why are we doing the work we're doing? And that need doesn't hit everybody. Some people don't need to know that, depending on where you are in your career. But anyway, so these are all mapped for me now. They're all mapped out. And, the motivational response index, that acronym became where we got MRI from, which just happens to be, a pretty cool metaphor for how to, think about an organization.
You did not just land on that. Was that coincidental?
It was one of those, I'm an advertising guy at heart. And I'm like, okay, what if I call it this? Motivational psychology and MMP? No, how about MRI? Because I felt like, in my heart of hearts, it was like, we need some kind of a machine that you could just slide the organization under and find out what's sick. Where are they sick? Is that a tumor, or is that, a bone that's supposed to be there?
Right.
So it was a little bit of a creative exercise for me.
The Culture MRI is so awesome. Like when I was introduced to it and then introduced to you guys, I just think it's such a powerful tool. As we wrap up here, I just wanted to get a little bit pragmatic about that. So what does that actually look like? What does the Culture MRI look like in practice? And how is it super useful and effective? Because I know it's a quick turnaround. Like one of its greatest powers is that it's fast. And so, just walk us through that real quick.
Well, I'll start by saying this. The reason anybody would be interested in the Culture MRI is if if you care about your culture, if you're working on your culture, what we're trying to do is we're trying to say, we're help you identify this is the area that's going to give you the biggest bang for your buck. And it's just like if you go to the doctor and you're like, hey, I think I want to, get LASIK surgery to fix my eye. And then, the doctor gives you a full workup and he goes, hey, did you realize you have, colon cancer? You might want to address that before you get this elective surgery for something or whatever. To put in just practical terms, there's a lot of people who are excited about the word culture and just the idea of, oh, I want to create a great workplace. And unfortunately, a lot of people end up expressing that interest in kind of random ways. In other words, the reason I'm interested in culture is because I read a book about culture, and it was all about essentially recognition. It was all about attaboys and how they can radically transform your organization. What happened to attaboys? Nobody gives them anymore. Or it might be, some brand new, I know about a year or two ago, one of the famous authors released a new sort of what's called a typological profiling. In other words, a way to understand how different people are wired. And that's brand new. And it's like this shiny object. But for a lot of companies, that wasn't the problem. But because it was new and shiny and it sounds relevant and it's inspirational, that's where they invested their limited resources of time and money to work on culture. Well, what happens if that's not where they were sick? What if they already had really good alignment between the people and the job roles? They had selected them very well and put them in the right place. So the MRI tool is primarily around, hey, let's find out what is going on inside this organization and what's working well. And is there any bad tissue that needs urgent attention? And so that's really the first thing to note about it. And the way we figure that out is twofold. We do an assessment. We send out with an email campaign and with nudges built into it to drive participation. This little click survey, they just click on a number 1 through 10 and it asks a series of questions and it basically populates that sort of, Maslow's hierarchy looking framework that we follow. And so we get a number on a dashboard and we can immediately go, oh, here's where the issues are. Because people will tell you if you create the right environment, like anonymous, confidential, people will tell you kind of where it hurts.
Yeah. I agree.
And so that's what we do. We're like, hey, is the pain in your elbow and your hip? And that tells us where the needs are of the organization. And then the second thing we do is, do a little bit of interviewing to figure out the narrative behind those little data points.
Yeah.
And that enables us to go back to the organization's leaders and say, hey, if you want the biggest bang for your buck, I would fix, kind of like the weakest link in the chain right now.
Yep.
So focus all your culture work in this area. But anyway, that's kind of the process. I mean, it's not that we have, totally different techniques. Is that we're very laser focused, and the framework is the key.
Yeah.
It's the framework that makes the whole difference because it's a causality tool as opposed to just, hey, let's measure engagement. Engagement's good or it's bad. And, what are we going to do about it? Well, here you're supposed to give everybody, feedback loops and, fruit loops. And, we need to match up the medicine with the illnesses.
Right. And you guys, like what really stands out to me about the Culture MRI is that you're able to reflect financial implications of those occurrences and those events that are happening.
Yeah, I mean, we found some old white papers that gave just a crystal clear, sort of the relationship between the amount of effort, that comes back depending on what engagement is. So, I mean, just to put it in simple math, if you pay someone $100,000, 46% of whatever they bring to work, 46% of that's determined by whether they're engaged or not. So there's just sort of 54% that's compulsory. Like if they stop coming in, then they're not going to keep working there. But 46% of it is they can still show up for their job every day and pass as an employee, but be withholding almost half of what they're capable of. And so we take those numbers and produced an algorithm, and we just take the labor investment of the organization. So if you've got $100 million in labor costs, and then we look at our engagement scores when they come back, and we're like, all right, well, that's out of the 46% that could have been, what is it? So you get a number, and what that does is it helps us again to understand, hey, if I was to invest in fixing this, taking people off the line, spending actual hard dollars or whatever, what kind of ROI could I ever get out of that?
Yeah.
So that's just important to know, because it helps us design remediation. I'm not going to put us through hell if it's just going to, kind of be a fun little thing for the weekend, and then everybody goes back and we're just as bored as ever. But
yeah. Or potentially kick the beehive
yeah,
and make
exactly.
it even worse.
Yeah. So we want to be able to measure before and after results of things. And the companies where we've done this, I mean, to turn it around is, we've had companies double their revenue in like 3 years with minimal investment. Most companies are already spending plenty of money on culture. They're just spending it in the wrong places. It doesn't have anything to do with where the organization's sick, or better put, it doesn't have anything to do with the actual needs that their employees have in order to thrive. And if they would just be able to understand, it's kind of like do I need vitamin C or vitamin A or vitamin D? It's like one of those is going to make a huge difference for me right now. But if I just take vitamin C because I don't understand that whole aisle, it really matters.
So if you had to give our audience a tip of sort of a prerequisite to Culture MRI, what would it be?
A prerequisite for it?
Yeah, like what could they think? What should we be thinking about before we get a diagnosis?
Well, let's see. What do you need to think about anything? I don't know. This is first of all, it's kind of a new topic. I mean, culture typically triggers for people almost like this, the air freshener that you spray right before the everything else is set, and it's like, oh yeah, let's do some culture too. So it's like this sort of, garnish on the plate. It's not part of the actual meal. That's the way people think about it. So I think the first thing is you have to understand the difference. The Culture MRI, and the reason we wrote a book called Culture is the New Leadership, is we're trying to say something very dramatic has changed. Culture is actually the operating system that is going to be successful with today's emerging workforce. So that's probably the first thing, is realize that this is a major shift in thinking. So maybe you need to read some of the book before this starts to make sense. It's not the kind of thing that you just have a conversation on an elevator and then go, thanks for the tip, now I know what to do.
Yeah, and you have to I think I'm glad that you said that, because I consistently land on, this is no longer an option. It's not a question of like, do we need this or do we not need this? It's a question of when are you ready to really address it, because it's a necessity.
Yeah, leadership is still important, and management's still important. But if you just look at the history of the last 30 years, it's been grossly incapable of achieving the objectives of the organization. Gallup measures year after year after year how engaged are the people? 31%. And the number hasn't changed in 35 years of measuring it. It's fantastic news for the consulting industry because we all are going to have plenty of reason to be hired year after year. But what about the tens of millions of workers who have to go to work every day and ask that question? How can a good job be so bad? And, for some people, they have to wake up every day, time to make the donuts, and so I think we can do a lot better. We've certainly, and I know the work that you guys are doing, we're out there proving it every day that if you get an accurate diagnosis and good medicine, you can change people's lives and you can change the organization's effectiveness too. So, I think in order to understand, back to your question, understand that this is not a trivial conversation. This is not like, oh, fun. Yeah, I've been wanting to do some. It's like, no, we're talking about really checking the operating system that runs the organization. Is it authority based? Is it influence based? Or is it really set up to release people into pockets of autonomy where they can thrive and they can express their motivation to be good at something or to believe in something or to belong to something, and do great work, and support the organization at the same time. You and I believe that design sensibility should exist. And we just have to have the right tools. So that's what I would say is you have to, to do the culture MRI. It's the other thing I would say is it's super simple as much as the mindset is significant. I mean, go online and take the survey yourself. You'll get a 16-page report that tells you things about your own career that you probably never realized before. And if you just play that against, wow, what if I did this for every person in the organization, the insights that it would reveal. And then we look at the financial algorithms for, hey, if I changed that, if I raised engagement by 5%, that would be worth $7.3 million, Anyway, it's a long conversation, but it begins very easily.
Yeah. Understanding that culture is fundamental and that it's impacting human lives, it's impacting communities, and it has a exponential effect. And we're here to try to change the world, man. It's exciting. Ben, thank you so much for joining me today. It was so awesome having you. I've been looking forward to this. So I hope it was fun for you. It was definitely fun for me. And tell our audience how they can reach you. I know I have the book here. Culture is the New Leadership. Yeah. Definitely grab a copy. I already started reading it. It's really very interesting and very enlightening. Yeah, well, I'd say the number one to get to me is through Nadir. Yes. But yeah, if you want to reach out to me, our website is theculturemri.com. We'd love to talk to you. We're going to tell you how Nadir and his team can change your world, and that we're just sort of in the background supporting what he does. The analogy I use all the time is that I'm just a radiologist. He's the doctor. I'm just a diagnostician, but Nadir's the one that actually can cure you. And so we're just kind of supporting him with the best data that exists, the best lens and understanding of the organization and its needs. So we're excited about supporting the work you guys are doing. Thank you, man. I really appreciate you saying that. And the excitement is mutual. I'm very excited for this as well. Looking forward to it.
Awesome.
All right, brother. We'll be in touch. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.